You want to understand and regulate your ADHD behaviour brain, you are in the right place. We are the neuroscience and the brain science behind behaviour. Because when we understand the brain, behaviour becomes easier, and we use neuroscience to make behaviour easy. I'm Danielle Douglas, the Behaviour Brain Consultant from Let's Talk Behaviour, and we use neuroscience to make behaviour easier. We proudly support over 80,000 educational influencers, teachers, schools, and children across 87 countries. And our multi-award winning tools and techniques underpin our models, frameworks, and now the behaviour curriculum. So I didn't wake up one day and think, you know what the world needs? Another behaviour specialist. This role was born out of pure desperation. In 2007, I walked into the classroom for the first time thinking, I want these 30 children to do what I want them to do and not what they want to do. And I learned the hard way. In 2011, I had my first class of significant special educational needs children within the mainstream classroom. I had over 70% of SEND children within my mainstream classroom. And after a really tricky Ofsted inspection, I was sitting in my car thinking, I either need to double down or I need to quit. And as no quitter, I doubled down. In 2016, I opened my first childcare business alongside teaching, and this grew to over 1,000 children a week, which was great. However, I had 30 adults looking at me for behaviour management advice, and the only things that I could offer them were opinions from other people. And that didn't work for me. So I decided and realised I needed to work with the most crisis and complex behaviours. I started working in a residential children's home and working with children with EBD and CSE. At 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, I would sit in my sleeping bag with my pen and my paper, writing down all the behaviours, the trauma behaviours that had happened in the day, and unpicking them and trying to understand why they'd happened. This was when I started to study neuroscience. Alongside being a foster carer, I studied neuroscience to unpick and understand the neuroscience and brain science behind behaviours. And over the last decade, we have had classrooms and homes that have been negative behaviour free, and that has led us to where we are today. So I want you to grab a pen and some paper because we forget 50% of information within an hour. That is a huge amount of information, and I want you to miss nothing. So what do you know about your ADHD behaviour brain, the ADHD behaviour brain? How do you regulate it? What do you know? What do you find the trickiest? What would you like to know about the ADHD behaviour brain? Here we look at the neuroscience versus school. And we like to do this with lots of different things and compare what we do in schools to what neuroscience tells us. And this is what we do with ADHD. Unfortunately, in our schools, we have very little support and training around ADHD. We are told to use calm down corners. We have got no training or support around actual ADHD behaviour brains. What do they look like? Why are they different to other behaviour brains? And we're also not told about dopamine and the impact that dopamine has on what this looks like in the brain. Now, neuroscience tells us within the ADHD behaviour brain, the amygdala is much larger. It's more reactive. It also takes longer and is harder for the prefrontal cortex to be engaged, which is an issue when we want children to listen, learn, process, or understand. We also know that the neuroscience tells us that the ADHD behaviour brain struggles to transmit and store dopamine, which is an issue when we don't understand that, because that is where the ADHD behaviours come from. So what does the ADHD behaviour brain look like? This is an image to show that our ADHD behaviour brains love interest over importance. So when we are thinking about children with ADHD and they are choosing to do things that they like, this is why. The children are looking for, or adults are looking for, the dopamine stimulation, which means they are always going to choose interest over importance. So when we are thinking about tasks that we want them to do or things that we would like the ADHD brain to enjoy, we need to think, what is the interest? How can we make it interesting to then make it important? This is the main image that we show for the ADHD behaviour brain. And I want you to think about the ADHD behaviour brain as being a cup, a lovely little cup, and it might be tea or coffee. And dripping into the brain, the ADHD behaviour brain, we've got the dopamine coming in. Now we know that the ADHD brain struggles to hold, store, transmit dopamine. It uses a huge amount of dopamine when the amygdala is engaged. When the amygdala is engaged, the dopamine is flooding out of that cup. So anything that triggers the amygdala, which we will talk about, means that you are using up dopamine faster than any other brain, the non-ADHD brains. This means that we need to keep filling our cup with dopamine, and that is where the behaviors come from. The searching and the replacement of the dopamine causes those ADHD behaviors because the brain is trying to constantly fill up that little cup. This means that it also looks like this. So we've got other behavior brains here. You can see there's a prefrontal cortex at the front, there's an amygdala at the back, and in between is a lovely clear road. And the brains can switch between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex because we need them both and we use them both. Now, the ADHD behavior brain here, you can see the amygdala is much larger. He also has a flame above his head, which means he's much more reactive. We've got the prefrontal cortex at the front, which is what we need to listen, learn, process, and understand. However, the road is much trickier. There's mountains in the way, and it is going to take much longer and much harder work to get the brain from the amygdala into the prefrontal cortex. And at the same time as this, we've got the brain that is dripping and flooding the dopamine. So you can see here very, very quickly that the ADHD behaviour brain is very different to a non-ADHD behaviour brain. However, it doesn't mean that it can't be supported. So how much do you know about the behaviour brains? Well, we do training around the behaviour brains and we can teach you everything you need to know. But here's a quick whistle-stop tour of the behaviour brains. So we've got two. We've got a prefrontal cortex pre and we've got an amygdala am. Our amygdala, he is the main guy for ADHD behaviour brains, and he's really good at protecting, keeping you safe. He is your emotional brain. So when we've got emotional behaviours or feelings, that fight, flight, freeze, that is the amygdala. He doesn't like danger, no rules, no new places, no new people. He doesn't like prediction. He likes everything as is. And then we've got the prefrontal cortex, and she is his little sister, and she is what you need to listen. So right now you'll be using your prefrontal cortex. So you need to use your prefrontal cortex for listening, learning, processing, understanding. But she can be taken over by Am. When she's tired, she needs something during an amygdala hijack, which we will also talk about, being hungry and needing things. Now, Am is the main character here for ADHD behaviours, and he's the one that makes us shout, worry, throw, hit, nervous. He's the one that uses, drains, and drinks all of the dopamine. So for any of these behaviours in our ADHD children or within their ADHD brains and behaviours, this is because Am is using up all of the dopamine and we need to replace it. He is for feelings and emotions. And like I said, we do training on the behaviour brain, so we can go into this much more. But he will trigger and take over the prefrontal cortex at any time he gets a hijack. An amygdala hijack can happen thousands of times in a day. And it can take milliseconds for it to take over, but it can take hours, if not days, to switch back. So we need a good understanding of these behaviour brains. But in the amygdala hijack, if a child has fallen out with a friend, if there is changes to an environment. A child's behavior can trigger an amygdala hijack. Hungry, thirsty, tired, a change in voice, a change in body language, all of these things can trigger an amygdala hijack, which means that this amygdala can take over the brain. Then we cannot listen, learn, process, or understand. So one of the first things that we need to do with our ADHD behaviour brain children is check what behaviour brain they are using. We want to keep our ADHD children in the prefrontal cortex. We want to limit amygdala hijack as much as possible. This is the Douglas hierarchy of behaviour brains, and this is linked directly to Maslow hierarchy of needs, which we've all known and we've all seen. Now, as you can see here, the bottom parts of the pyramid are linked directly to Maslow hierarchy of needs. And if children are sitting in the bottom part of the pyramid, they are using the amygdala. We want them to be using that prefrontal cortex. So by being aware of the psychological needs of children, hungry, thirsty, tired, do they feel safe? Are they loved? If any of these things are missing, they are sitting in the amygdala already, which means they are draining dopamine, which means higher and more ADHD behaviors. So, for example, my behavior using AM in a day. Is the child hungry? Are they tired? Are they visiting a new place, a new seat, a new room? Is it a new person? Are they hot? Are they cold? Tried something new? And these are all things that we can monitor and prepare children for to keep them out of the amygdala and in the prefrontal cortex. Because remember, in the amygdala, they are draining the dopamine, which means more ADHD behaviors to replace the dopamine that the amygdala has taken. So let's take an even deeper dive now into the ADHD behaviour brains. So the ADHD behaviour brains and behaviours are due to dysregulation and the deficiency of dopamine. Let's read that again. ADHD behaviours are due to the dysregulation and the deficiency of dopamine, which means we need to regulate dopamine as soon as we see those ADHD behaviours. Just like I said before, our amygdala is like our big brother. In our ADHD brains, he is much bigger. He is much more protective. He will jump in faster and stay for longer. This means it's much harder to transfer the brain from the amygdala into the prefrontal cortex. I will talk about how we can change the brain from the amygdala into the prefrontal cortex. But we need to be aware that amygdala there, he is trying to protect us. He is trying to save us from danger. He is trying to take over that prefrontal cortex and make sure that we and our bodies are safe. He is faster and more reactive in ADHD behaviour brains than he is in non-ADHD brains. So just a quick recap of everything that we've spoke about so far. The ADHD behaviour brains are like dopamine black holes. We've got a little cup and it's got a hole in and the dopamine is draining out really quickly. We know that the amygdala uses up lots of that dopamine. So we need to take the amygdala out of action and put our prefrontal cortex in action. Exercise is the fastest way to regulate dopamine, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But exercise, distraction, question, problem solving, these are really good ways to turn off that amygdala and turn on that prefrontal cortex. Dopamine is responsible for regulating ADHD behaviors. So let's take a closer look at dopamine. So this is the dopamine, and our brains, the ADHD brains, are dopamine drains. They are draining that dopamine out, and we are looking to replace that dopamine all the time, which is where that distraction, the attention, the sensory seeking, the movement, the fidgeting, all of those behaviors are because the brain is searching for dopamine. It is looking for dopamine to put dopamine back into the body as quickly as possible. Something else that is really important about dopamine is that dopamine is responsible for stopping, limiting, or pausing impulse behaviors. So we know impulse behaviors in children. So for example, the one I can think of on the top of my head is shouting out. Shouting out is an impulse behavior. Now, impulse behaviors are limited and stopped and paused by dopamine. So if children don't have enough dopamine in the system, they cannot control those impulse behaviors. So the next time you see an impulse behavior, I want you to think dopamine. Before we go on to tools and techniques to actually support the ADHD behavior brain, the last thought I want you to think about: ADHD brains have a 30% difference in developmental delay. This means that executive functions like emotions and behaviors that we would expect to see, ADHD behavior brains have a 30% reduction in this. And this is because that prefrontal cortex, remember, is much smaller. So when we are looking at children with ADHD, we might think that they act a little bit more immature than peers of their age, and this is exactly why. So this means that children of a 10-year-old might have skills closer to a 7-year-old, and it might help to set expectations, that realistic expectations for those children. And I always think about this when I think about my husband. So a 21-year-old brain is more likely in comparison to a 30-year-old with ADHD, and this sits right. So if you've got ADHD children that are more emotional and more reactive, this is why. But it also means that it can be learned, practiced, and taught. So we can fill this gap, this 30% rule, we can fill this by teaching children about emotions, by practicing emotional behaviors, emotional responses. We can teach, learn, and practice all the behaviors that we would like to see. So let's take a look at exactly what we can do to support and help ADHD brains. The first thing that we can do is routines and structures. Our ADHD brains need routine and structure. What happens in the brain is if we have not got a routine or a structure in place, the brain will jump into something called prediction failure. Now, prediction failure means that the amygdala is going to take over straight away. Our brain likes to predict exactly what is going on to keep us safe. And if it cannot predict what is going to happen, the amygdala will take over straight away. So this means that having routines, structures, timetables, this will help ADHD brains stay in the prefrontal cortex and disengage the amygdala. Another thing that we can do is try and turn off the amygdala and switch on the prefrontal cortex. And there are simple tricks that we can use for this. So to engage the prefrontal cortex, we either need to use exercise, distraction, questioning, or problem solving. And this is a great one. Now, using the 7 times table, we can really quickly switch off the amygdala and bring in the prefrontal cortex. So the magic 7s draws on much more power and strength from the brain than any other times table or questioning. So if you've got children who are experiencing ADHD behaviors, what we can do to regulate them really, really quickly is get them to count in the 7s. This might be forwards or backwards. And I use this when I'm going into presentations or I'm trying to fall asleep. I can hack the brain from the amygdala into the prefrontal cortex by using the magic 7s. Another hack that we use for ADHD behavior brains is interest versus importance. Now, we know the ADHD brain will choose interest over importance. However, we still need to do the important tasks. So how can we get children to do the important tasks while make it interesting? Now, what we do here is try to tie in as many of the tasks as possible to things that children like, or tie an important task to added dopamine. How can we add dopamine into every task that we are doing to try and get that dopamine dripping into the brain, to try and keep the ADHD behavior brain interested? Now, this might be things like adding music, adding a reward at the end, using positive reinforcement. How can we make it fun, make it a game, get that brain adding dopamine into every single task and activity to keep the ADHD behavior brain getting dopamine and being interested? On top of this, and something else we need to think about, is real versus false dopamine. Now, there is real versus false dopamine, and this can affect the brain really, really stronger than we ever thought. So, false dopamine, for example, is things like social media, sugar, fatty foods, by using our phone screen time. And real dopamine is things like outdoors, reading, exercise, in-person connections. We would always try and replace dopamine in ADHD behavior brains by using real dopamine. False dopamine can cause crashes and cravings, and children can get stuck in false dopamine cycles. So when we have children with ADHD that might look like they really want to game, or they want to play on social media, or they want to scroll on their phones, this is because the false dopamine has caused such a high and such a crash that it then causes dopamine addiction. So when we are replacing or adding dopamine into ADHD behavior brains, we want to opt for as much real dopamine as possible. Alongside this, we've got too high to not enough dopamine. So during the day and watching our ADHD children, we need to be monitoring and thinking about, we don't want them to provide them with too much dopamine because that will flood the cup. However, we don't want to let their cup empty because then they've got no dopamine to pull from. So thinking about balancing the dopamine out and observing the ADHD children. When have they had too much dopamine? High energy, impulsive, insomnia, competitive, failing to finish a task. When have they not had enough dopamine? When are they tired or unhappy, not motivated, almost seem depressed? There's no enjoyment in things. How can we balance that dopamine out really, really carefully? And that is dependent on different children, but we need to watch and study, monitor that real versus false dopamine, and add in dopamine when needed. Here's one of the biggest regulation mistakes that we see in schools at the moment. So we've been told for years, I have been told for years, to use calm down corners to regulate our ADHD children. This is the worst advice that can be given. Remember, we've got a cup and it is draining out dopamine. Now, if you're hungry, would you rather have a grape an hour or a whole meal until you're full? Because I know that I would rather have a full meal until I was full. Now, what happens is calm down corners limit dopamine secretion in brains and bodies. So a calm down corner will only drip dopamine into the brain. This means you've got the cup, it's draining out dopamine, and you are dripping dopamine in one drip at a time. Compared to stimulating and giving dopamine as fast and as hard as possible, which will fill up the cup and replace that dopamine really, really quickly. So what's happening is we are being told to use calm down corners and calm them down and breathing exercises. We are not replacing the dopamine that's missing. Remember, the behaviors are due to and searching for dopamine. We need to replace the dopamine as quickly and as efficiently as possible. There is research that shows that 10 minutes high intensity exercise and replacement of dopamine is much better on the brain and the ADHD dopamine filling than 30 minutes of slow. So we like to say short, sharp, and sweaty. So remember I said before, there are 4 ways to switch. So if we can see a child is using the amygdala, they are draining dopamine. We want to get them out of the amygdala into the prefrontal cortex. These are the 4 ways that we are going to do it. Exercise, questioning, problem solving, or distraction. So what I want you to do is think about 4 different activities that you are going to use to regulate dopamine within the body, to switch the brain from the amygdala into the prefrontal cortex. You have got ADHD children, and we are going to regulate them using these 4 methods to pull them out of the amygdala into the prefrontal cortex. Now, what we use is a dopamine menu, and this is for our ADHD children, and this has a mixture of these 4 activities in. And what this does is linked to their interests. we provide activities to get the dopamine flowing back into their bodies. It might be useful to help children to create these cards and these activities because they can then help you decide what's going to go on there to replace that dopamine as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So what if I have a child with ADHD in the mainstream classroom? I have had many children over the last 19 years in my classroom with ADHD, more than one every single year. And this is what we did. So within the classroom, we would have our routines to keep the brain in the prefrontal cortex. At all times, I would make sure that the routines, the structures, everything was in place to engage the prefrontal cortex. I would then have my dopamine menu, and during the day, every single time that I would see those children needed dopamine replacements, we would do one of the dopamine or the ADHD activities. This might mean a quick 5-minute HIT class. This might mean a question or activity session based on what their interests were. So use the dopamine menu within your mainstream classroom, because you know what? If the ADHD child needs their dopamine regulating, I can guarantee that all the other children in the classroom needed it as well. And over the last 19 years, we have successfully included those children in the classroom, and everybody else has also managed and participated and benefited from me adding those activities in the mainstream classroom day. How can I keep the ADHD behaviour brain in the prefrontal cortex as much as possible? Now, remember, I told you we do training on the behaviour brains. So if you would like to know more information about the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, we do training on that. However, just remember, your prefrontal cortex likes routine and structures and visuals and not having to predict anything. That amygdala brain is triggered by need. It's triggered by emotion. It is triggered by the unknown. So if we can keep the amygdala as limited as possible and that prefrontal cortex as engaged as possible, children won't need to top up the ADHD behaviour brain. Alongside the training for the behaviour brains, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, we've got the neurodiverse in the mainstream classroom toolkit. This is to help you plan for your neurodiverse children within the mainstream classroom. We also have an ADHD workbook and activity book, which explains all of the ADHD behaviour brains and has activities to help regulate and support ADHD behaviour brains. If you would like to know more information about behaviour brains, ADHD behaviour brains, or the neuroscience behind behaviour, you're in the right place. I'm Danielle Douglas. Let's talk behaviour.